I woke up to silence. The house felt heavier than usual, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't find my keys. My wallet wasn't where I left it. Nothing made sense. I sat on the edge of the bed, shaking, staring at the walls I thought I knew. Everything I built, everything I trusted, felt like sand slipping through my fingers. The calls, the quiet laughs, the small gestures, they were all shadows. And the truth. The truth hit harder than anything I imagined. Someone I let inside my life, someone I trusted more than myself, had been keeping a part of it from me. A part that changed everything, and as I sat there, my chest tight, I realized this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I thought I knew what my life was. I had routines, small victories, little rituals that made me feel safe. I woke up early, brewed my coffee exactly the way I liked it, reviewed the numbers on my screen before anyone else arrived at the office. My life was structured, predictable, and steady. I liked it that way. I liked knowing where I stood and what I could control. I trusted people carefully. Not everyone, but the ones I let in. My family, a few close friends, my husband. Those were sacred spaces. I wasn't careless. I didn't overshare. I listened more than I spoke, watched more than I acted. That had always been my way of protecting myself. My trust was earned slowly, and once it was given, I didn't question it. Marriage felt like an extension of that trust. It was quiet, companionable, not perfect, but safe. I relied on him without thinking twice. We didn't fight about money or schedules. We had an understanding, a rhythm. I never needed grand gestures. I needed consistency, honesty, the small ways people prove they are steady when no one is watching. I believed I had that. I wanted to believe I could depend on him completely. There were tiny moments that now make sense only in hindsight. Little inconsistencies I chose to overlook because I wanted to see the good in him. A missed dinner here, a forgotten call there, slightly off explanations, stories that didn't quite line up. I remember thinking, he's busy, stressed, tired. I excused it. I didn't want suspicion to take root. The first real warning sign came subtly. I was balancing our shared accounts one evening, routine work for me, when I noticed a withdrawal I didn't recognize. Not a huge amount, just enough to make me pause. I asked him about it. He shrugged, said it was a transfer for work. I must have forgotten. I let it go. I wanted to, but I noted it, quietly, like a small seed buried deep in soil, waiting. After that, the unease grew slowly. I started noticing patterns I hadn't before. Receipts that didn't make sense, small purchases on cards that weren't ours, texts that pinged late at night, quickly deleted. I didn't confront him immediately. I watched, I tracked. I used my skills at observation, the ones that served me so well at work, to quietly map out the gaps, the contradictions. I told myself I was paranoid. I told myself I was imagining it. But the pit in my stomach told a different story. I tried to carry on as usual. We went to work, made dinner, watched the same shows, laughed at the same jokes. I smiled, participated, acted normal. Inside, I was cataloging everything, every anomaly, every small lie, every secretive glance. I became aware of him in ways I hadn't been before, like noticing the way a shadow shifts when the light changes, subtle but unmistakable. Then, one evening, it hit, clear, undeniable, and terrifying. I was filing some papers, sorting through shared documents for tax purposes, when I found it. A document buried under months of correspondence, something I had never been told about. My name, my signature, used in a context I hadn't authorized. Legal, documented, intentional. I froze. My hands shook. I held the papers as though letting go would make the truth vanish, but it didn't. I read the lines again and again, thinking maybe I had misinterpreted something. But every word confirmed it. He had been acting behind my back in ways that affected everything I had worked for. Our life together, the money, the stability. I hadn't realized how fragile it really was until that moment. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. I sat there in the quiet room, staring at the words, feeling everything I trusted unravel. The betrayal wasn't some whispered secret or a small mistake. It was deliberate, methodical, a life lived in parallel to mine, a life I hadn't been invited into. My reality, the one I had painstakingly built, suddenly felt like a facade. I remember thinking I should confront him immediately, yell, demand answers, but I couldn't, not yet. My mind went through every angle, every possibility, every scenario I could imagine. I felt the old, familiar part of myself, the cautious, measured part, taking over. This wasn't something to react to hastily. I had to understand it first. I had to see it clearly. Every memory shifted. The laughter at dinners, the weekend trips, the quiet nights at home, they all felt different now. Like I had been watching someone else's life play out, thinking it was mine. And the thing that terrified me most was how calm I had been. Calm enough to let this go unnoticed for months, possibly years. Calm enough that no alarm bells had rung loudly enough for me to notice. I stayed in that room for what felt like hours, but it was probably minutes. I ran through the paper again and again. Each read made the reality sharper. Each line etched the weight of the betrayal deeper into me. And with it came a new, strange clarity. I understood the extent of the deceit, the thoughtfulness of it. Nothing was accidental. Everything had been designed to hide in plain sight, to manipulate trust, to bend perception without leaving obvious scars. I felt hollow, yet alive in a way that frightened me. My sense of self, my life, my assumptions about the world, they were gone, but beneath the shock, a cold awareness was forming. I knew one thing. I had been underestimated. I knew now that the person I had trusted most thought he could fool me, thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I folded the papers slowly, carefully, as if handling something fragile. My hands no longer shook, but my heart pounded in a different rhythm, steady, slow, calculated. I realized then that this wasn't just loss. This was an invitation, a challenge. I didn't yet know how or when or what the consequences would be. But I knew one thing for certain. The story hadn't ended here. Not by a long shot. I closed the folder and set it on the desk. I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The room was silent except for my breathing. And in that silence, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel yet. Not rage, not despair, something colder, something that waited, patient, careful, watching. And I realized with a clarity that made my skin prickle that everything he had done, every secret he had hidden, would eventually surface. Not because I was impulsive, not because I would act without thought, but because I would see it through. And in that quiet moment, with the document lying between us, I finally understood. I had been betrayed by the one person I thought I could never doubt, and the betrayal was only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the document over and over in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about how carefully he had orchestrated it, how every detail had been accounted for, how he had relied on my trust to move unnoticed. It wasn't just the financial implications, though those were staggering. It was the erosion of everything I believed about us, about myself, about the life I thought I knew. The next morning, I went through our accounts again. I checked every statement, every transfer, every expense. At first glance, it looked like minor discrepancies, almost unnoticeable. But as I traced each line, each number, the pattern became clear. Money had been siphoned, moved quietly, invested in ways I wasn't aware of, and not just a few thousand here or there, enough to destabilize the life we had built together, enough to make me doubt how secure I had ever been. I felt sick. My hands shook as I looked at the totals. I'd trusted him to manage part of it, to be honest. to keep our lives safe. And now I realized how little of that was real. The foundation I had relied on, our home, our savings, our plans, was a construct, carefully built on trust he had already violated. The first twist hit when I found an email account he'd never mentioned, hidden, encrypted, completely separate from anything I had access to. At first, I told myself it was probably work-related. He traveled often, maybe it was for clients, for projects, but as I dug, I saw patterns. Messages to names I didn't recognize, attachments, transfers, confirmations, all things that weren't work. And each time I tried to process it, I felt my stomach drop a little further. I remembered a trip we'd taken the previous summer. He had been working remotely, spending hours on his laptop at cafes, smiling at me in the evenings, telling me everything was fine. Looking back now, I could see the way he had folded documents carefully, minimized screens when I walked past. That smile, that calm, companionable facade, it had been practice. He had been rehearsing for years, it seemed, to make sure I never caught on. The second twist came a few days later, when a routine phone call from a friend made my chest tighten. I casually mentioned a minor investment we had discussed as a joke months ago, just to feel normal, and her voice changed. She hesitated, then asked if I was aware of certain partnerships he had made in my name. She wouldn't give details, said only that it had big consequences, and that he had acted without telling me. My throat went dry. What I had thought was a minor financial error was the tip of a much larger, more deliberate pattern. I started second-guessing myself. Had I really ignored the signs? Had I been so focused on trusting, on being rational, that I had missed the obvious? I replayed every conversation, every meeting, every transaction, every "I forgot" suddenly felt rehearsed. Every late night at the office, every evasive answer, deliberate. My mind felt both sharp and fragile. I couldn't trust my instincts. I couldn't trust what I thought I knew. The third revelation came when I discovered something personal. Not financial, not work-related, but intimate. Photos, messages, records of interactions with someone else. Someone I never suspected. Not some fleeting affair, but a calculated relationship that had been maintained for years, always hidden, always separate. And what cut deeper than the secrecy was the way he had kept it meticulously organized, as if he knew exactly what would happen if it ever came to light. He had made it impossible for me to discover by accident. I felt like a trespasser in my own life. Guilt crept in. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I been naive? Had I missed chances to prevent this? Should I have noticed the small changes, the subtle absences, the minor lies? My mind oscillated between anger, grief, and a strange shame. It felt as if the betrayal had not only stolen from me, but also reflected my own blind spots, my trust, my belief in the people I allowed close to me. Then the fourth twist arrived unexpectedly. I was looking through old statements, trying to map the full scope of his financial maneuvering, when I noticed an old investment account under my name that I had never seen before. It wasn't just hidden. It had been accumulating quietly without my knowledge, and the balance was enormous. My first reaction was relief. Then came confusion. Then dread. Because in that account were actions that could implicate me legally if anyone investigated. Actions I had no knowledge of, signed documents I didn't remember, transfers I didn't authorize. Not only had he betrayed me, but he had positioned me as the one who could take the fall. I sat in the quiet of the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I didn't drink, staring at the papers. Everything felt like it was closing in. The life I thought I had, steady, predictable, safe, was gone. It had been a mirage. Every conversation, every routine, every smile now carried a hidden weight I hadn't been prepared for. Self-doubt became relentless. I questioned my judgment, my ability to read people, my instincts. I doubted the smallest things. Had I truly known him, truly known myself, truly known the life we had? And more terrifyingly, I began to wonder if I had ever mattered to him at all, or if I had only been a convenient ally in the construction of a life I wasn't invited to share. The fifth and heaviest revelation hit when I checked the tax filings. He had filed jointly, used my information, made decisions that could have had lasting consequences for me personally, not just financially. He had been playing a game I didn't know existed, moving pieces behind my back, preparing for scenarios I hadn't even imagined. And as I stared at the pages, the reality became unbearable. The betrayal wasn't just about money or secrecy. It was about control. My autonomy had been stripped slowly, quietly, methodically. I felt suspended in a haze of grief, fear, and disbelief. My relationships outside the marriage felt tenuous, as if the betrayal had cast a shadow over everything I had believed about people, trust, loyalty. Even my closest friends and family, would I ever look at them the same way again? Could I believe anything or anyone without hesitation? The foundation of my life had shifted beneath me, and I had no immediate way to anchor myself. I tried to sleep, but the mind doesn't rest in the presence of betrayal like this. Every memory played backward and forward. Every word he had said, every glance, every touch, it was filtered through the lens of deception. The person I loved, the life I thought I had, the home I trusted, they were all illusions. And underneath the hurt, a new emotion began to pulse. A quiet, simmering awareness that things could not stay like this. It wasn't rage, not yet. It wasn't hysteria. It was a cold, careful understanding. I knew that exposing this, untangling it, reclaiming control, it would take time, patience, strategy, observation, but it was possible. And I also realized that the betrayals were deeper than I had imagined. They weren't random or opportunistic. They were intentional, calculated, personal. The moment that broke me, truly, completely, came when I uncovered the final piece. He had used my professional reputation to secure loans, manipulate contracts, and create opportunities for himself. Every skill, every credential I had worked for, every word I had spoken in meetings, all had been co-opted without my consent. The world I trusted professionally, the life I built carefully, had been infiltrated by him. My credibility, my identity, my sense of self, it had all been compromised. I sank to the floor, back against the wall, staring at nothing. The air felt thick, as though it weighed against my lungs. The quiet, methodical betrayals, each more personal than the last, each eroding a part of me I hadn't known could be taken, left me hollow. I was surrounded by proof of his deception, all meticulously documented, all undeniable. And in that silence, I realized something terrifyingly simple. I wasn't just betrayed. I was a puzzle he had solved, a life he had manipulated, a person he thought he could break without consequences. I closed my eyes and the weight pressed down on me, but beneath it, a flicker remained. I didn't yet know what I would do or how I would respond, but I understood one thing clearly. Nothing would be the same again. I didn't confront him. Not then. Not even when every instinct screamed to demand answers. I moved through the days quietly, deliberately, like someone learning how to walk again without drawing attention to the limp. Emotional restraint became survival. I spoke when necessary. I nodded. I listened. I watched him more closely than I ever had, not with suspicion anymore, but with clarity. Silence gave me information. Anger would have given me noise. I began documenting everything, not obsessively, methodically. I kept copies where he wouldn't look, timestamps, versions, trails. I treated my own life like an audit. Every interaction became data. Every decision he made left a mark. I didn't change my routines. That was important. Predictability kept him comfortable. Comfort made people careless. There were moments when the weight nearly broke me. Sitting across from him at dinner, hearing him talk about the future, watching him plan with confidence he hadn't earned. I would feel the heat rise in my chest, the urge to say his name differently, to ask one question that would shatter the room. I swallowed it. Every time. Not because I was weak, because I was choosing something harder. I struggled with the morality of it. I had been raised to believe that truth should be immediate, that silence meant complicity. There were nights I lay awake wondering if by waiting, I was becoming something I didn't recognize, if restraint was just another form of fear. But then I would remember the papers, the signatures, the way my life had been rearranged without my consent. And I understood that truth, handled recklessly, can be wasted. I wasn't plotting harm. I wasn't fantasizing about humiliation. I was preparing for alignment, for the moment when facts would sit exactly where they belonged. I consulted professionals quietly, not to accuse, to understand. I asked neutral questions, hypotheticals. I learned what options existed, what timelines mattered, what documentation carried weight. Each answer steadied me. There was a path forward that didn't require raised voices or broken things. It required patience. He started to sense a shift, not enough to panic, just enough to adjust. He became more attentive, kinder, as if intuition had brushed past him without stopping. I noted it. Affection can be a tactic when control feels threatened. I accepted it calmly, without returning more than necessary. The moral conflict sharpened when I realized how easy it would be to end it quickly. One disclosure, one email, one meeting. I could collapse the illusion in a single afternoon. The temptation was real. Clean endings are seductive when you're in pain, but clean endings often leave truth scattered. I needed it intact. I chose truth over anger, even when anger begged to be chosen. I waited for confirmation, not because I doubted myself anymore, but because inevitability needs structure. I watched him make decisions that assumed my ignorance. I watched him leverage time, people, systems, and I learned how he thought, what he feared, what he underestimated. He underestimated process. He believed speed protected him. That was his mistake. I prepared disclosures the way one prepares a case, not a confrontation. I organized facts so they spoke without me. I imagined rooms where I wouldn't need to raise my voice because the documents would do it for me. I imagined silence falling in places he thought were secure, not as revenge, as consequence. There were moments of grief that had nothing to do with him. I mourned the version of myself who trusted without reservation. I mourned the years that would now always carry an asterisk. Sometimes I cried in the car before work. Sometimes I felt nothing at all. Emotional restraint doesn't mean numbness. It means choosing when to feel. I also hesitated. More than once. I asked myself who this would hurt beyond him. I asked myself whether exposing the truth would fracture more than it healed, whether staying silent would be the more merciful path. These questions mattered. I didn't dismiss them. I let them slow me down. But each time I hesitated, something new surfaced. Another record, another inconsistency, another quiet proof that what he had done wasn't contained to us. It extended outward. It touched people who trusted me, people who deserved clarity. Silence stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like erosion. The inevitability settled in slowly, not as resolve, but as acceptance. This wasn't about punishment. It was about correction. Systems correcting themselves once the truth was introduced. I didn't need to push. I only needed to stop shielding. I rehearsed nothing. I didn't plan speeches. I planned timing. Timing is everything when the goal is truth. I waited until the facts were complete, until my footing was solid, until I could stand in any room without explaining myself. When doubt crept in, I reminded myself of one thing. I wasn't inventing anything. I wasn't exaggerating. I was choosing when to stop absorbing the damage silently. I still moved through our life as if nothing had changed. That was the hardest part. Sharing space with someone who didn't know the ending had already been written. There were days I felt cruel for it. Then I remembered how long he had lived beside me, knowing more than I did. I wasn't mirroring him. I was reclaiming agency. The final hesitation came quietly on an ordinary afternoon. I stood in my office, looking at the last set of documents I needed. Everything was there, clean, legal, irrefutable. I realized that once I acted, there would be no undoing it. No return to the before, however false it had been. I closed the folder and sat down. I breathed. I asked myself one final question. Was this driven by anger or by alignment with reality? The answer was clear. I didn't feel triumph, I felt calm. The kind that arrives when a decision stops wobbling. I understood then that revenge didn't need to announce itself. It only needed to arrive on time. And I knew I was done waiting. I didn't reveal everything at once. I released the truth the way pressure escapes a sealed room. Slowly, invisibly at first, then impossible to ignore. One document, one inquiry, one corrected record, each step small enough to look harmless on its own. Together, they began to change the air around him. The first shift happened at work, not mine. His. A routine compliance check turned into questions he hadn't anticipated. Nothing accusatory, just requests for clarification. He mentioned it casually over dinner, laughed it off, said it was standard procedure. I listened. I nodded. I said nothing. But I noticed how his tone had changed, how his confidence had thinned at the edges. A week later, an account was frozen temporarily. Administrative delay, he called it. I saw the email before he did. The language was polite, precise, unemotional, the kind of language that doesn't argue. It simply states, he spent that evening making calls, pacing, trying to sound relaxed. I sat on the couch and folded laundry. The quiet between us stretched, unfamiliar and tight. Then came the corrections. Financial records amended. Ownership clarified. My name removed where it never should have been. Each correction triggered another review, another pause in his carefully maintained momentum. People began asking him to explain things he had assumed no one would ever question. He had built his confidence on invisibility. Now he was being seen. He stopped sleeping well. I could tell by the way he moved in the mornings, by the stiffness in his shoulders. He checked his phone constantly, refreshed emails, lingered over messages longer than necessary. Still, he didn't suspect me, not fully. He assumed the system was malfunctioning. That bureaucracy was being difficult. He believed problems came from outside forces, never from the inside. The second collapse was social, quieter but sharper. Invitations slowed. Conversations shifted. I noticed people watching him differently, listening more carefully, responding less warmly. Trust erodes silently. It doesn't announce itself. It simply withdraws. One evening, someone asked him a question he couldn't answer cleanly. He laughed too quickly. The room noticed. I stayed steady. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't correct anyone aloud. I let facts travel where they needed to go. People talk when there's nothing to defend. They connect dots on their own. That kind of realization lasts longer than accusation. Then came the third layer. Legal correspondence, formal, measured, unavoidable. He brought the letter home and read it twice before speaking. Asked me if I'd ever seen anything like it. I said no. Not because I was lying, because I had never seen this version before. The version where his own choices were finally answering him back. His reputation didn't explode. It thinned. Opportunities hesitated. Doors paused instead of opening. People who once returned his calls immediately began to take time. He noticed, he tried to compensate, he spoke more, explained more, justified more. Each word made it worse. The fourth collapse was internal. I saw it in his posture, in the way certainty abandoned him. He began revisiting old conversations, asking what I remembered, what I thought. Searching for reassurance, I no longer gave freely. He wasn't afraid of punishment. He was afraid of exposure, the slow kind, the kind that doesn't end. When the final pieces aligned, it happened quietly. A meeting he wasn't invited to, a decision made without him, a contract revised, then withdrawn. Nothing dramatic, just absence, influence fading, control slipping. He asked me one night if something was wrong, not with us, with everything. I looked at him and felt no urge to explain. The truth was already moving. It didn't need my voice anymore. The consequences didn't arrive as chaos. They arrived as structure. Investigations concluded, findings documented, actions taken, no spectacle, just alignment. His name began to carry weight of a different kind, not scandal, caution. I watched the life he had built on secrecy recalibrate itself around reality. I felt no satisfaction, only relief, the kind that comes when you stop holding something together with your own silence. In the end, there was nothing left for me to do. The truth had finished its work. I didn't wait for applause, for confrontation, for the moment people would look at him and finally see the man I had seen in fragments for years. That wasn't my purpose. My purpose was truth. Complete, unavoidable, indisputable truth. It unfolded in layers as it always had. The accounts corrected, the misappropriated funds returned, and the contracts amended. The emails and messages I had quietly preserved were now in the right hands. People who had once trusted his words now had the facts. The lies that had built him up were exposed as carefully constructed illusions. Each step had been deliberate, and each step had been observed quietly, without drama. He called me one morning after a meeting I had anticipated he would never handle well. He asked calmly, almost humbly, if I knew the full extent. I didn't answer. There was nothing to explain. He could see it himself in the way colleagues avoided eye contact, in the subtle shifts in tone when his name came up. He could feel the distance growing, the doors that had once opened effortlessly now closed with polite firmness. The financial damage had been mitigated legally, but his professional credibility could not be repaired. Even if he had wanted to rebuild, the trail of manipulated documents and unauthorized decisions left him exposed. Contracts he had assumed were secure were voided. Collaborators who had depended on him quietly shifted alliances. He moved through rooms with the same confidence he once had, but it no longer worked for him. People no longer accepted his certainty as truth. He had relied on their trust. Now he was navigating with none. I watched all of this unfold as if from behind a screen. Not for revenge's sake, but for clarity's sake. He hadn't known the patient, calculated observer sitting quietly beside him in daily routines. He hadn't known someone could methodically prepare a path for truth without emotion, without theatrics. That was my advantage. That was the lesson hidden in years of betrayal. Patience multiplies power. There were moments I felt the old pangs of grief, though. Nights when I remembered the early days, when laughter felt genuine, when I thought the life I had been living was stable and real. I felt anger flicker, but I didn't let it guide me. I felt sadness, heavy and unrelenting, for the version of myself that had been naive enough to trust completely. But every time, I reminded myself that restraint had carried me farther than passion ever could. He started to realize it too, subtle, private realizations that came to him in quiet moments, missed opportunities, contracts rescinded, colleagues hesitant. I noticed the way he paused when he typed an email, the way he reconsidered a sentence before sending it. Even at home, he asked fewer questions, spoke less confidently. Not because I said anything, but because the consequences had caught up. The life he had relied upon was no longer his to shape. There were those around him who tried to soften the impact. Advisors, friends, acquaintances, all offering guidance, sympathy, suggestions for damage control. But none could erase the facts. The facts had weight, the truth had gravity, and gravity does not negotiate. He attempted, for a brief moment, to charm his way through the situation. Casual conversations, small smiles, gestures meant to signal normalcy, but credibility is cumulative, and by then it was gone. Even 1,000 smiles could not rewrite the story documented in contracts, emails, and accounts. Even 1,000 polite reassurances could not erase the evidence I had collected, the corrections I had quietly enacted, the professional consequences set in motion. There was one final turning point. A meeting I did not attend, documents I did not sign, words I did not speak. Yet the results were mine. People finally spoke openly. Decisions that had once depended on his approval now bypassed him. Key contracts he had assumed would be renewed were declined. His name, once associated with competence and reliability, became a cautionary note. Quietly, invisibly, irrevocably, the truth settled around him. I didn't gloat, I didn't celebrate. I simply watched the results, and in that watching, I felt a weight lift. Years of deception had been met with consequences precisely proportional to their intent, not more, not less. And I realized with a heavy, clear certainty that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives as silence, as methodical alignment, as the world responding naturally to facts without emotion. I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in months. Not relief in a dramatic sense, not triumph in the way movies depict, but calm, enduring relief. The betrayal that had haunted me, reshaped me, taught me patience, had finally reached its natural conclusion. And the man who had once believed he could manipulate trust and control outcomes now existed within the boundaries he had chosen for himself, boundaries defined by truth, not deception. The last piece fell into place quietly, at home. He tried one final assertion of control, a suggestion, a casual remark, something meant to sound authoritative. I listened, I nodded, I said nothing. The silence itself spoke, as it had for months. And I realized he was fully aware now, not only of the external consequences, but of the irreversible shift. There was no path back to certainty, no whispered reassurances that could undo the reality now visible to everyone who mattered. I thought about the versions of myself that had been vulnerable, trusting, hopeful. I let them rest. I thought about the version of him that had built his life on lies. I let that version end. I didn't have to watch it collapse, just as I hadn't needed to act violently or loudly. I didn't need to witness his realization. The facts had moved naturally. The truth had done its work. I walked through my own days differently then, quietly aware of boundaries I would never again surrender so easily. I kept routines, I measured trust, I observed patterns, but I also carried a calm strength, the kind that comes from knowing one has endured violation, absorbed it, and navigated it with patience and clarity. I had watched a life built on deception dismantle itself through reason and consequence alone, and in that watching, I felt the depth of human resilience and the quiet inevitability of accountability. In the end, the house returned to its stillness. The financial records were settled. Relationships influenced by deception reoriented themselves around honesty. The man who had once lived in shadows of his own making existed now in full exposure. He didn't plead, he didn't rage, he adjusted, recalibrated, and accepted. And the gravity of truth remained constant around him. I didn't speak about it to anyone outside what was necessary. There was no need for declarations, no audience required. The truth had been spoken in a language louder than words. Facts, consequences, alignment, silence, patience, methodical execution, these had ensured the story concluded precisely as it should. And I finally understood something simple and terrible. Patience is stronger than passion, clarity stronger than instinct, and truth, when delivered steadily and without excess, is unstoppable. I looked at the quiet home, the settled accounts, the papers I had prepared, and I let my chest release its tension. Everything was as it should be. No chaos, no spectacle, just the natural end of a carefully constructed deception. And for the first time in years, I felt completely unburdened, because the world, finally, had caught up with the truth. He sat across from me one evening, quiet, measured, aware. The man I had loved or thought I had was still there physically, but not in the ways that mattered. His control, his certainty, his illusions, all gone. He understood that. I didn't look at him. I didn't speak. I simply let the moment exist. Calm, complete, final. And in that quiet, I realized I would never need to speak the words aloud to know it. The life he tried to hide could not exist anymore. Not anywhere, not ever. And I had survived to witness the end.